The great hall of the Galactic Council fell silent as Elder Kethmore stepped forward, his blue skin shimmering under the artificial lights. Around him, representatives from dozens of alien species watched with growing concern. The massive screens displayed images that made even the most hardened warriors uncomfortable. 3 small creatures huddled in the corner of a sterile room, their crystalline shells cracked and dull, their 6 limbs trembling with fear. "The Vorthak cubs are dying," Elder Kethmore announced, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Not from disease or injury, but from something far worse. They have lost the will to grow strong." The assembled delegates murmured among themselves. The Vorthak had been the galaxy's fiercest warriors for over 1,000 years. Their young were supposed to be unstoppable forces of nature, growing rapidly into powerful defenders of their homeworld. Instead, these cubs remained small, weak, and terrified. "We have tried everything," continued the elder. "The aquatic Murdai offered to raise them in their healing pools. The cubs became more aggressive and tried to destroy the sacred waters. The hive mind Zephyrians attempted to integrate them into their collective consciousness. The cubs rejected the connection so violently that 3 Zephyrian nodes were damaged. Even the gentle Floran, who can nurture any living thing, gave up after the cubs destroyed their most precious gardens." A voice from the back of the hall spoke up. "What about the Zentari method? Strict discipline and combat training from birth?" Elder Kethmore's expression darkened. "We tried that first. The cubs became so traumatized they stopped eating. 2 nearly died before we could intervene." The hall buzzed with worried conversations. If the mighty Vorthak could not raise their own young, what hope was there for the species? But Elder Kethmore raised his hand for silence. "There is one option we have not tried," he said slowly. "The newest members of our galactic community, the humans." The reaction was immediate and loud. Laughter, scoffs, and outright dismissal filled the air. The humans had joined the galactic community only 5 years ago, and most species still considered them soft and primitive. They were known for their emotional attachments and their strange habit of caring for weak members of their society, instead of abandoning them. "You cannot be serious," declared Ambassador Vextar of the warrior caste Cronians. "Humans coddle their young instead of strengthening them. They show mercy to their enemies and waste resources on the sick and old. How could such weak creatures possibly help the Vorthak?" Elder Kethmore waited for the noise to die down. "Perhaps that is exactly why they might succeed where we have failed. Every species has approached this problem with their own methods. We have tried strength, tried wisdom, tried healing, tried integration. All have failed. Maybe it is time to try something completely different." The debate continued for hours, but eventually, desperation won over pride. The Vorthak cubs were dying, and the humans represented the last hope. The vote was close, but it passed. A message would be sent to the human colony ship New Sol. 3 days later, on the agricultural deck of New Sol, Hyunwoo Kim was checking the growth progress of his tomato plants when his communicator buzzed. The 34-year-old botanist had been enjoying the quiet routine of his work, far from the chaos of his previous job as a teacher back on Earth. Space was peaceful, he had discovered, and plants were much easier to understand than children. "Hyunwoo, please report to Conference Room 7 immediately," came the voice of Captain Woojin Park. The tone was serious enough to make Hyunwoo worry. He quickly washed his hands and made his way through the ship's corridors, wondering what he could have possibly done wrong. The conference room was packed with the ship's senior staff. Captain Park sat at the head of the table, while Dr. Ji-eun Park, the xenobiologist, stood beside a large screen showing what looked like scientific data. Security Chief So Young-han looked unusually tense, and Dr. Ye-jin Choi, the medical officer, was frowning at a tablet in her hands. "Hyunwoo, Captain," Park began, "please sit down. We have received an unusual request from the Galactic Council." Hyunwoo took the offered chair, his mind racing. "Is this about my research on alien plant compatibility? Because I can explain the minor explosion in Lab 3. "No," the captain interrupted with a slight smile. "This is about something much more important and much more dangerous. Dr. Ji-un Park activated the screen showing images of the 3 Vorthak cubs. Hyunwoo had never seen a Vorthak before, but even he could tell these creatures were not healthy. Their shells looked dull and cracked, their eyes were dim, and they moved with the sluggish motions of animals that had given up hope. The Galactic Council wants us to take care of these cubs, Dr. Park explained. Every other species has failed. The cubs are dying because they cannot adapt to traditional child-rearing methods. The Council has decided to try the human approach. What does that have to do with me? Hyunwoo asked. Though he was beginning to suspect, he already knew the answer. Captain Park leaned forward. They specifically requested you, Hyunwoo. Your background as a teacher, combined with your work with Earth's endangered species rehabilitation programs, makes you the ideal candidate. But I work with plants now, Hyunwoo protested. I chose botany because plants don't talk back or have emotional problems. Security Chief So Young-han spoke up. According to the Council's message, that might be exactly what these cubs need. Someone who approaches them without preconceived notions about how they should behave. Dr. Ye-jin Choi added, the medical data is concerning. These cubs should be twice their current size by now. They should be aggressive, curious, and constantly testing boundaries. Instead, they barely respond to stimuli and refuse most food. It's as if they have completely shut down. Hyunwoo studied the images more carefully. Something about the way the cubs positioned themselves reminded him of the rescue dogs his grandfather used to rehabilitate. Animals that had been hurt learned to make themselves as small and invisible as possible. They stopped trusting, stopped hoping, and eventually stopped living. What happens if I say no? He asked quietly. Captain Park's expression grew grave. The Council was very clear. This is a test of humanity's place in the galactic community. Success means continued membership and respect. Failure means isolation and possible expulsion from galactic space. The room fell silent. Hyunwoo looked around at the faces of his crewmates. These people had become his family over the past 3 years. The thought of humanity being cast out because he was too afraid to try made his stomach clench. What do I need to know about Vorthak biology? He asked finally. Dr. Ji-un Park's face brightened with relief. They're silicon-based life forms with 6 limbs and crystalline exoskeletons. They're omnivores, but they prefer high-energy proteins. They grow rapidly when healthy, reaching adult size within 2 standard years. They're highly intelligent and naturally social, though current Vorthak society has moved away from pack behaviors. Naturally social, Hyunwoo repeated, but they're being raised in isolation. Current Vorthak doctrine separates cubs from all adults except designated trainers at 6 months of age. The theory is that this makes them self-reliant and prevents emotional weakness. Hyunwoo thought about his grandfather's old rescue dogs again. And these cubs were separated even earlier because they were being sent to other species for care. Exactly. The youngest was only 3 months old when removed from its birth pack. Something clicked in Hyunwoo's mind. These weren't defective cubs who needed to be fixed. These were traumatized children who needed to learn that the world was safe again. His grandfather had always said that strength came from security, not from fear. When do they arrive? He asked. Captain Park smiled for the first time since the meeting began. Tomorrow morning. The Council transport will deliver them along with all available research data and supply requirements. That evening, Hyunwoo stood in his quarters, looking at the space he would soon share with 3 alien cubs. He had requested that the furniture be moved against the walls and that several soft sleeping areas be prepared. If these cubs were anything like traumatized Earth animals, they would need places to hide until they felt safe enough to explore. He thought about calling his parents back on Earth, but the time delay would make conversation impossible. Instead, he recorded a message explaining the situation and asking for their support. His mother had always been better with frightened creatures than he was. As he prepared for bed, Hyunwoo found himself remembering his grandfather's voice. Every creature deserves to feel safe before you ask them to be strong, the old man had always said. Fear makes cowards of us all, but love makes heroes. Tomorrow, he would find out if human love could save alien children. The fate of humanity's place in the galaxy depended on it. The transport bay doors opened with a hiss of equalizing air, and Hyunwoo got his first real look at the three Vorthak cubs. They were much smaller than he had expected from the images, barely reaching his waist in height. Their crystalline shells caught the artificial light and threw it back in fractured rainbows, but the effect was dulled by the cracks and worn patches that spoke of stress and poor health. The cubs huddled together in their containment field, 6 legs each pressed against the floor, their large eyes darting constantly around the bay. When the field deactivated, they did not run or attack as previous reports had suggested they might. Instead, they pressed closer together and made a soft humming sound that Hyunwoo somehow understood as distress. "These are your charges," announced Transport Officer Veltar, a tall Zentari with obvious disdain in his voice. "The small one is called Storm, the one with the darker shell is Talon, and the largest is Shard. They have destroyed property belonging to 7 different species and injured 4 caretakers. We wish you better luck than your predecessors." Hyunwoo nodded politely but kept his attention on the cubs. Storm, despite being the smallest, had positioned herself between the other 2 and the adults in the room. Her posture reminded him of a mother dog protecting her puppies. Talon was systematically examining every surface and exit, his eyes tracking movements with the intensity of someone looking for escape routes. Shard had collected several small objects that had fallen during transport and was arranging them in a careful pattern. "Thank you for bringing them safely," Hyunwoo said to the transport officer. "I can take over from here." Veltar looked surprised. "You are not going to secure them first? They are known to be violent and unpredictable." "They don't look violent to me," Hyunwoo replied, slowly lowering himself to sit cross-legged on the floor several feet away from the cubs. "They look scared." The transport officer made a sound of disgust and left, muttering something about humans and their foolish sentiment. Captain Park, Dr. Ji-eun Park, and Security Chief So-young Han remained, watching from a safe distance as Hyunwoo simply sat quietly near the cubs. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. The cubs remained huddled together, occasionally making their soft humming sounds. Hyunwoo simply sat and breathed steadily, letting them get used to his presence. He had learned from his grandfather that patience was the most important tool when dealing with frightened animals. Finally, Shard took a tentative step forward, the young cub's large eyes fixed on Hyunwoo's face, searching for signs of threat. When Hyunwoo remained perfectly still, Shard took another step, then another. The other cubs tensed, ready to flee if danger appeared. Shard stopped just outside, of arm's reach, and made a different sound, a sort of questioning chirp. Hyunwoo responded with a soft hello and watched as the cub's head tilted in curiosity. After a moment, Shard returned to his siblings, and all 3 began making quiet sounds to each other. "They're talking," Dr. Ji-eun Park whispered. "The previous caretakers never reported vocalization between the cubs." Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. The cubs were not the violent, destructive creatures described in the reports. They were highly intelligent children who had learned that adults meant pain and separation. Every aggressive act had been a desperate attempt to drive away another potential source of trauma. Min-ho Lee, the ship's xenopsychology researcher, spent hours observing the cubs with Hyunwoo. The former child psychologist was fascinated by what he was seeing. "Look at their behavior patterns," Min-ho explained to Hyunwoo during one of their evening debriefing sessions. "Storm always positions herself as the protector, but she's also the one who initiates contact with you. She's testing whether you're safe for the others. Talon maps every space they enter and always knows where the exits are. That's classic hypervigilance behavior. And Shard collects and organizes objects as a way of creating control in an unpredictable environment." "So they're not defective," Hyunwoo said. "They're traumatized." "Exactly. And trauma responds to consistency, safety, and patience. All things that previous caretakers apparently lacked." Security Chief So-young Han had initially been skeptical of Hyunwoo's methods. When he removed all barriers between his quarters and the cubs' designated space, she objected strongly. "They could hurt you," she warned. "The reports say they've injured caretakers before." "Only when those caretakers tried to force them to do things they weren't ready for," Hyunwoo replied. "I'm not going to force anything." His approach seemed to work. Within a week, The cubs were freely moving between their space and his quarters. They had established routines that made them feel secure. Storm would check all the spaces each morning, making sure nothing had changed during the night. Talon would test various objects and surfaces, satisfying his need to understand his environment. Shard would reorganize his collection of interesting items, which now included several small tools that Hyunwoo had deliberately left where the cub might find them. The breakthrough came during the second week. Hyunwoo had caught a minor illness, from exposure to alien bacteria. Nothing serious, but enough to leave him with a fever and fatigue. He had been lying on his sleeping mat when he woke to find all 3 cubs arranged around him in a protective circle. Storm was positioned where she could see the door, alert for any threats. Talon had somehow adjusted the room's temperature controls to a more comfortable setting. Shard had brought water and food, items he had carefully selected from Hyunwoo's supplies. Dr. Ye-jin Choi was amazed when she arrived to check on the patient. "They've created the perfect recovery environment," she told Captain Park later. "The temperature, humidity, even the lighting has been optimized for human comfort." How did they know what he needed? They observed, Min-ho Lee suggested. For weeks, they've been watching every aspect of his behavior. They learned to read his needs better than most humans could. But the most significant moment came when Hyunwoo was feeling better. He was sitting up eating soup that Shard had somehow prepared from ingredients in his kitchen, when alarms began blaring throughout the ship. It was just a drill, but the cubs had never experienced the loud emergency signals before. Instead of panicking or becoming aggressive as their files suggested they would, the cubs immediately moved into formation around Hyunwoo. Storm took point, her posture alert but not fearful. Talon positioned himself to guard their flank, while Shard moved to protect their rear. They were ready to defend their human against whatever threat the alarms announced. Security Chief So Young-han, who was observing the drill, was stunned. "They're acting like a trained military unit," she reported to Captain Park. "But no one taught them those formations." "They're Vorthok," Dr. Ji-eun Park reminded everyone. "Combat tactics are literally in their genes, but previous caretakers reported that they couldn't work together at all. Because they didn't trust each other," Hyunwoo realized. "Or trust their caretakers. But now they do." Word of the cubs. Progress reached the Galactic Council and the response was mixed. Elder Kethmore was pleased but concerned. Other council members were skeptical, wondering if the humans had somehow weakened the cubs by making them too dependent. But there were other developments that worried the council even more. Reports were coming in from across the galaxy of young members of various species, seeking out human colonies and requesting the human method of care. Parents were beginning to question their own species' child-rearing practices. The most disturbing report came from the Zentari homeworld itself. A group of Zentari younglings had refused to participate in their traditional combat trials, claiming they wanted to learn cooperation instead of domination. The scandal had reached the highest levels of Zentari government. In Sujung, the colony, ship's communications officer, intercepted several encrypted transmissions between council members. The content made him deeply worried. "They're starting to see us as a threat," he reported to Captain Park. "Some council members think we're deliberately undermining their cultures by changing how their children think." Captain Park called an emergency meeting with his senior staff in Hyunwoo. The botanist-turned-caretaker sat quietly as the implications of their success were discussed. "We're in a dangerous position," the captain explained. "If we succeed too well, we become a threat to established galactic order. If we fail, humanity loses its place in the galactic community." "What about the cubs?" Hyunwoo asked. "They're finally healing. They're growing stronger every day. Storm has gained 15% body mass in the past month. Talon is showing problem-solving abilities that exceed adult Vorthak norms. Shard has created art that expresses complex emotional concepts his species supposedly doesn't understand." "That might be exactly the problem," Dr. Ji-eun Park said quietly. "We're not just healing them. We're changing what it means to be Vorthak." As if summoned by their conversation, the 3 cubs appeared in the doorway to the conference room. They had learned to recognize when Hyunwoo was troubled and had come to investigate. But instead of the fearful, huddled creatures that had arrived months ago, They stood tall and confident, their shells now gleaming with health. Storm stepped forward and made a complex series of sounds that everyone in the room somehow understood as a question. Is our family in danger? 3 months into the test period, Hyunwoo made a discovery that would change everything. He was reading through ancient Vorthak cultural texts with xenoarchaeologist Donghyun Yu when they found something that made them both stop and stare at the screen. This can't be right, Donghyun muttered, scrolling through the translation software's output. According to this text, traditional Vorthak society raised their young in communal groups called shell bonds. Multiple adults would care for all the cubs together. Hyunwoo leaned closer to read the ancient symbols. Look at this passage. It says that cubs who were separated from their shell bonds before maturity often died of something called spirit fade. The symptoms match exactly what we saw when Storm, Talon, and Shard arrived. They spent the next week diving deeper into Vorthak archaeological records, and the picture that emerged was shocking. For thousands of years, Vorthak cubs had been raised in large, cooperative groups. Adult Vorthak would share responsibility for teaching, protecting, and nurturing all, the young in their community. Cubs learned not just combat skills, but also cooperation, empathy, and complex social behaviors. The current practice of separating cubs and raising them in isolation was recent, dating back only 300 years to the end of a devastating civil war. The Vorthak leadership had decided that emotional attachments made warriors weak, so they changed their entire child-rearing system to prevent strong bonds from forming. They thought they were making their species stronger, Dong-hyun explained to Captain Park during their briefing. Instead, they created a generation of traumatized individuals who couldn't work together effectively. Dr. Ji-eun Park added her own findings. The medical data supports this theory. Modern Vorthak have significantly higher rates of mental illness, shorter lifespans, and lower reproductive success than their ancestors. They've been slowly killing their own species with kindness. But the revelation that truly shook the galactic community came from an unexpected source. Soo-jin Kim, a 17-year-old intern working on the agricultural decks, had been spending her free time with the cubs. As the youngest human on the ship, she connected with them in ways that surprised everyone. She was in the hydroponics bay with Storm, Talon, and Shard when the environmental systems malfunctioned. A critical valve had stuck open, threatening to flood the entire section with nutrient solution that would kill all the food crops. The automated systems had failed, and manual intervention required someone to operate 3 different control panels simultaneously. Soo-jin watched in amazement as the 3 cubs instantly coordinated their response. Storm took the primary control panel, her 6 limbs allowing her to manipulate multiple switches at once. Talon positioned himself at the secondary controls, his problem-solving mind immediately understanding the complex sequence needed. Shard took the tertiary panel and began adjusting flow rates with mathematical precision that impressed even the ship's engineers. In less than 2 minutes, they had not only stopped the flood but optimized the entire system's performance beyond its original specifications. When the emergency was over, they simply returned to playing as if nothing unusual had happened. They didn't think about it, Soo-jin reported to Hyunwoo later. They just saw a problem that threatened their home and worked together to fix it. No arguments, no competition, just pure cooperation. The news of this incident reached Elder Kethmore just as he was preparing for an inspection visit to the human colony ship. The Zentari leader had been under increasing pressure from other council members who were concerned about the human influence on alien youth. Several species were reporting that their young were beginning to question traditional authority structures and demanding more cooperative approaches to education and governance. When Elder Kethmore arrived with his delegation, he expected to find either broken cubs or evidence that humans had somehow made them weak and dependent. Instead, he was greeted by 3 young Vorthak who had grown 40% larger than normal for their age, displayed unprecedented problem-solving abilities, and showed fierce loyalty not just to their human caretaker, but to the entire ship's community. Ambassador Tae-ho Shin, humanity's representative to the Galactic Council, had arrived on the same transport as Elder Kethmore. He had been prepared for potential diplomatic disaster, but instead found himself witnessing something extraordinary. The test came when Elder Kethmore demanded to see the cubs' combat capabilities. In traditional Vorthak culture, young adults were expected to demonstrate their strength through ritualized battles with designated opponents. Elder Kethmore had brought a junior Zentari warrior specifically for this purpose. Storm stepped forward to accept the challenge, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of immediately attacking as traditional Vorthak training demanded, she studied her opponent carefully. She observed his movements, noted his strengths and weaknesses, and then began a combat sequence that was unlike anything the observers had ever seen. Rather than relying on brute force and natural aggression, Storm used strategy and adaptation. She turned the Zentari warrior's strength against him, used his assumptions about Vorthak behavior to create openings, and demonstrated a level of tactical thinking that exceeded most adult warriors of any species. But what truly shocked Elder Kethmore was that Storm had clearly held back. She had defeated her opponent decisively but without causing serious injury, showing a level of control and mercy that traditional Vorthak training actively discouraged. How is this possible? Elder Kethmore demanded of Hyunwoo. She fights like a master strategist, but she shows compassion for her opponent. This contradicts everything we know about proper warrior development. Maybe that's the problem, Hyunwoo replied quietly. You've been training warriors instead of protectors. Warriors fight to defeat enemies. Protectors fight to defend what they love. Talon and Shard demonstrated similar capabilities when tested, each showing abilities that surpassed adult norms while maintaining the cooperative spirit they had learned under human care. They worked together seamlessly, covering each other's weaknesses and amplifying each other's strengths. Elder Kethmore requested private meetings with each of the cubs, speaking with them in traditional Vorthak communication patterns. What he learned disturbed him deeply. These cubs had not lost their Vorthak identity under human care. Instead, they had recovered their species' original nature, the cooperative and protective instincts that had been systematically bred out of modern Vorthak society. They remember things that our current generation has forgotten, he told Ambassador Taeho Shin during a private conference. They speak of shell bonds and community protection, concepts that haven't been part of Vorthak culture for centuries. How do they know these things? Maybe the knowledge was always there, the ambassador suggested. Maybe humans just created an environment where that knowledge could surface again. The implications were staggering. If humans could help Vorthak cubs recover their species' lost abilities, what could they do for other species? The question became even more urgent when reports began arriving of similar requests from across the galaxy. The aquatic Mirdai had sent a formal request for human assistance with tadpoles who refused to undergo metamorphosis. The energy-based Luminar had asked for help with juvenile forms who could not achieve stable coherence. The crystalline geode species wanted guidance with offspring who shattered at the slightest stress. Each species reported the same problem. Their traditional child-rearing methods were producing increasingly dysfunctional young who could not adapt to adult responsibilities. But species that had observed the human approach were beginning to see dramatic improvements in their own youth development programs. Dr. Haiwan Lim, the ship's developmental biologist, began documenting patterns across all the data they were receiving. Her findings suggested that the human approach of secure attachment, providing safety and understanding before demanding performance, was universally beneficial for developing minds, regardless of species. It seems that consciousness itself requires certain conditions to develop properly, she explained to the senior staff. Fear, isolation, and premature pressure create damaged minds. Safety, connection, and patient guidance create healthy ones. This principle appears to transcend biological differences. But the real test of this theory came when long-range sensors detected something that made everyone's blood run cold. A Void Hunter fleet had entered the sector, the first confirmed sighting of the galaxy's ancient enemy in over 50 years. The Void Hunters were creatures of pure malevolence, beings that existed only to destroy and consume. They had no interest in conquest or resources, only in the elimination of all other life forms. Every species in the galaxy feared them, and with good reason. The last major Void Hunter incursion had cost billions of lives. As emergency broadcasts went out to all ships and colonies in the sector, something unexpected happened aboard the New Soul. While adult crew members prepared for potential evacuation and defensive measures, the three Vorthak cubs began exhibiting behavior that no one had ever seen before. Storm, Talon, and Shard went into what could only be described as a tactical planning mode. They began making complex vocalizations to each other, creating diagrams with available materials. The Vorthak battle fleet arrived 3 days after the Void Hunter sighting, their massive ships bristling with weapons and radiating barely contained aggression. War Chief Grondar had come personally to reclaim what he considered stolen property, bringing with him enough firepower to reduce the human colony ship to atoms if necessary. Captain Woojin Park found himself in the unprecedented position of hosting a diplomatic meeting between species that had never intended to negotiate. The main conference room had been hastily reconfigured to accommodate the massive war chief, whose crystalline armor reflected the lights in threatening patterns. "You have corrupted our young," Grondar declared, his voice carrying the authority of 1,000 victories. "They were sent to you for strengthening, not for this soft weakness you call compassion. Return them now, and we will overlook this contamination of Vorthak purity." Ambassador Taeho Shin started to respond diplomatically, but Storm stepped into the room before he could speak. The young Vorthak had grown considerably in the months under human care, but she was still small compared to the towering war chief. What she lacked in size, however, she made up for in presence. "I challenge your authority," she said in perfect high Vorthak, using formal words that made everyone in the room freeze. "You claim leadership over us, but you have never earned that, right through strength or wisdom." The silence that followed was deafening. No untrained cub had ever issued such a challenge to a war chief. According to ancient Vorthak law, such an insult could only be answered through combat, but everyone assumed Storm was too young and inexperienced to survive such an encounter. War Chief Grondar's laugh was like grinding stone. "You dare challenge me, weak shell? Very well. Let us see what human softness has taught you about true Vorthak strength." The combat area was cleared in the ship's largest cargo bay, with representatives from multiple species gathering to witness what many expected to be a tragic execution. Elder Kethmore tried to intervene, arguing that the challenge was invalid due to Storm's age, but Vorthak law was clear. Once issued and accepted, a formal challenge could only be resolved through battle. Hyunwoo wanted to stop the fight, but Storm approached him with a confidence that surprised him. "Do not fear for me, Teacher Guardian," she said, using a term that had no equivalent in human language but somehow conveyed both respect and deep affection. "You taught me that strength comes from protecting what we love. Today I will show them what that strength looks like." The battle began with War Chief Grondar attempting to end things quickly through overwhelming force. His massive frame and centuries of combat experience should have made the outcome inevitable. Instead, he found himself fighting an opponent who seemed to anticipate his every move. Storm did not rely on the berserker tactics that modern Vorthak warriors were taught. Instead, she used strategy, patience, and adaptation. She studied Grondar's patterns, identified his weaknesses, and slowly began to control the flow of combat. When he expected aggression, she showed restraint. When he anticipated retreat, she pressed forward with calculated precision. Major Ji-ho Kang, the ship's military advisor, watched the battle with growing amazement. "She's not just fighting him," he observed to Captain Park. "She's teaching him. Every move she makes is designed to expose flaws in his technique and force him to adapt." The turning point came when War Chief Grondar, frustrated by his inability to defeat a mere cub, began using tactics that violated the formal rules of challenge combat. Storm could have responded with similar violations, escalating the battle into a potentially lethal encounter. Instead, she did something that shocked every Vorthak observer. She stopped fighting and offered Grondar her surrender, but not in the traditional manner. She knelt in the ancient posture of strength teaching, a ritual that had not been performed in Vorthak culture for over 400 years. It was a way for a superior warrior to end combat while preserving their opponent's honor, typically used by master trainers with their students. I yield to your experience, War Chief, Storm said in the formal cadences of Old Vorthak. But I ask you to consider whether the strength you seek to preserve might be better served through wisdom than violence. War Chief Grondar stood frozen, his weapon raised but unable to strike. Every instinct told him to finish the combat, to reassert his dominance through decisive victory. But the ritual Storm had invoked was sacred to his people, and to violate it would make him unworthy of his rank in the eyes of every Vorthak observer. Where did you learn the old ways? He demanded, his voice carrying confusion instead of anger. From the memories that live in our shells, Storm replied. The humans did not teach me to be weak. They taught me to remember what it truly means to be Vorthak. The implications of her words rippled through the assembled crowd. If Storm was right, if the cubs were recovering lost aspects of Vorthak culture rather than being corrupted by human influence, then everything the modern Vorthak believed about strength and proper child rearing was wrong. Before anyone could process this revelation fully, the ship's emergency alarms began blaring. The Void Hunter fleet had arrived ahead of schedule, and they were already engaging the outer defense perimeter. The time for philosophical discussions had ended. What happened next would be remembered as the turning point in galactic history. As adult warriors from various species struggled to coordinate their responses, hampered by centuries of species-based prejudices and incompatible command structures, the young beings raised under human guidance began to act. Storm took command, not through force or intimidation, but through demonstrated competence and the trust she had earned from her multi-species companions. Talon immediately began analyzing the Void Hunter attack patterns and identifying weaknesses. Shard started coordinating resource allocation and strategic communications between different groups. The Mirdai juveniles used their natural affinity for energy manipulation to boost the ship's defensive systems beyond normal parameters. Luminar younglings formed a communication network that allowed instant coordination between all defending forces. The Geode offspring created protective barriers that could withstand Void Hunter weapons, while remaining transparent to friendly fire. War Chief Grondar watched in stunned silence as Storm coordinated a defense that his own military commanders could never have achieved. She was not just leading other cubs. She was integrating their unique abilities into a seamless whole that amplified everyone's strengths while compensating for individual weaknesses. This is impossible, he muttered to Elder Kethmore. No Vorthak commander has ever achieved this level of multi-species coordination. How is a cub accomplishing what our greatest military minds cannot? Because she was raised to see cooperation as strength instead of weakness, the elder replied, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and regret. We taught our warriors to dominate. The humans taught her to unite. The battle raged for 6 hours, with Void Hunter forces pressing closer to the colony ship, despite the fierce resistance. Traditional military doctrine called for evacuation or last-stand defensive positions, but Storm had a different plan. She organized a counterattack that used the unique abilities of every species present, creating combination tactics that the Mimer Void Hunters had never encountered. Vorthak cubs provided close combat support while Mirdai juveniles disrupted enemy energy systems. Luminar younglings created communication networks that allowed perfect coordination while Geode offspring formed mobile defensive positions. The strategy worked beyond all expectations. The Void Hunter fleet, accustomed to facing fragmented resistance from various species fighting independently, found themselves confronting a truly integrated defense force that adapted to their tactics in real time. The decisive moment came when Storm led a boarding action against the Void Hunter command vessel. Instead of the suicidal assault that traditional military thinking would suggest, she coordinated a precision strike that targeted the enemy's central control systems while minimizing casualties on both sides. When the Void Hunter commander fell, the rest of their fleet retreated in confusion. They had never encountered opponents who could match their coordination and exceed their adaptability. The victory was complete, but the cost had been significant. Several young defenders were injured, and some would carry the scars of battle for the rest of their lives. War Chief Grondar was among the first to reach the wounded, and what he saw there completed his transformation. The injured cubs were not crying or demanding special treatment. Instead, they were comforting each other across species lines, sharing strength and providing emotional support that helped everyone heal faster. They fight like warriors but care, like family, he observed to Hyunwoo. This is not weakness. This is evolution. The aftermath of the battle brought delegations from across the galaxy. Every species wanted to understand how human child-rearing methods had produced warriors who could achieve what their own traditional approaches could not. The requests for human guidance went from a trickle to a flood. Elder Kethmore made an announcement that would reshape galactic civilization. The Council hereby recognizes humanity as a guardian species, entrusted with the care and development of young beings from any race that requests such assistance. 6 months after the Void Hunter battle, Hyunwoo stood in the observation deck of the New Soul, watching as Storm, Talon, and Shard prepared to board the transport that would take them back to the Vorthak homeworld. They were no longer the frightened, traumatized cubs who had arrived in containment fields. They had grown into confident young adults, their crystalline shells gleaming with health and their movements radiating the quiet strength that came from inner security. But they were not traveling alone. A team of human advisors, led by Master Sergeant Kyung-ho Bae, would accompany them to help establish new child-rearing programs throughout Vorthak space. The former military instructor had volunteered for the position after witnessing the cubs' performance during the battle, and he now carried the responsibility of training an entire species to rediscover their capacity for cooperative strength. "Are you ready for this?" Hyunwoo asked Storm as she made her final preparations. The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Storm would be returning as more than just a successful student. She would be an agent of change in a culture that had forgotten how to nurture its young. Storm's response came in the form of a gentle touch against his arm, a gesture of affection that would have been impossible for her when she first arrived. "You taught me that being ready is not about having no fear," she said. "It is about caring more for others than you fear for yourself. My people's cubs are afraid and alone just as I was. They need someone to show them that the world can be safe." Talon approached with his characteristic systematic thoroughness, carrying a carefully organized collection of items that represented his time on the human ship. "I have documented 37 different human child-rearing techniques that can be adapted for Vorthak physiology," he announced. "I have also identified 42 points of failure in current Vorthak training methods. The data suggests a 93% improvement rate if proper modifications are implemented." Shard, who had become the artist and philosopher of the three, offered his own perspective. "The humans did not change what we are," he said thoughtfully. "They helped us remember what we were meant to become. Now we must help others remember as well." The farewell ceremony was attended by representatives from dozens of species, all of whom had come to witness the departure of the cubs who had changed galactic understanding of child development. Elder Kethmore spoke for the assembled delegates, his words carrying the weight of official policy. These young ones returned to their homeworld not as strangers, but as bridges between what was and what could be. They carry with them the hope that every species can rediscover the strength that comes from compassionate guidance rather than fearful control. Ambassador Tae-ho Shin added humanity's perspective. "We are honored to have been trusted with their care, and we are proud of what they have accomplished. But we want every species to understand that the success belongs to them, not to us. We simply provided the environment where their natural potential could flourish." As the transport departed, Hyunwoo felt a mixture of pride and sadness. These cubs had become like his own children, and letting them go required the same trust he had asked them to learn during their time together. But he also felt excitement for what they would accomplish in the wider galaxy. The transformation was already beginning. Reports were arriving daily from across galactic space of young beings who had been raised under human guidance achieving remarkable things. A group of Merdai juveniles had developed new techniques for underwater construction that surpassed anything their adult engineers could create. Luminar younglings had discovered ways to share consciousness across vast distances without the traditional loss of individual identity. Geode offspring were creating artistic works that expressed emotions their species had thought impossible to feel. But the most significant changes were happening in how different species viewed their relationships with each other. The multi-species cooperation that had defeated the Void Hunters was becoming a model for broader diplomatic and economic relationships. Trade agreements that had been stalled for decades were suddenly being resolved by negotiators who had learned from watching human-guided youth work together. Dr. Hai-Wan Lim was documenting these changes in her research facility, now expanded, to include representatives from 47 different species. Her findings were reshaping understanding of consciousness development across the galaxy. What we're seeing is not just improved individual development, she explained to a gathering of galactic scientists. We're witnessing the emergence of a new form of civilization based on cooperative rather than competitive principles. The young beings raised under human guidance think differently about problems, relationships, and responsibilities. The practical applications were remarkable. Engineering projects that had been considered impossible were being completed by teams of mixed-species youth who combined their unique abilities in ways that adult minds had never conceived. Scientific discoveries were accelerating as young researchers from different backgrounds shared knowledge without the territorial concerns that had historically limited interspecies cooperation. Teacher Minji Han had arrived from Earth specifically to help establish formal educational programs based on the human approach. Her background in childhood development made her invaluable in training other species educators to recognize and nurture their students' natural potential. The key is not to impose human methods on alien children, she explained to a group of Zentari teachers who had come to learn. The key is to understand what every developing mind needs: security, understanding, and the freedom to explore their capabilities without fear of punishment for making mistakes. Veterinarian Sang-Woo Park brought a different perspective, focusing on the biological aspects of multi-species child development. His research was revealing that many species had evolved complementary capabilities that were enhanced when developed in cooperative rather than competitive environments. Each species has unique gifts, he observed, but those gifts reach their full potential only when the young feel secure enough to experiment and fail and try again. Fear restricts development while trust allows it to flourish. Child therapist Hei-Rin Yu was perhaps the most important addition to the team, as she worked with young beings who had experienced trauma under traditional child-rearing methods. Her techniques for helping them recover were being adapted for use across dozens of species. Trauma responses are surprisingly similar across different types of consciousness, she noted. Whether the mind is biological, energy-based, or crystalline, the need for safety and understanding in order to heal appears to be universal. The challenges were significant. Not every species was ready to abandon traditional methods that had been used for millennia. Conservative factions on many worlds resisted the changes, arguing that human influence was weakening their cultural identity. Some conflicts became violent, with traditionalists attempting to prevent their young from accessing human-guided education. But the results spoke for themselves. Worlds that embraced the new approaches saw dramatic improvements in mental health, technological innovation, and social cooperation. Planets that rejected human guidance continued to struggle with the same problems that had brought them to seek help in the first place. The most dramatic example came from the Vorthak homeworld itself. Storm, Talon, and Shard had established a demonstration school where traditional Vorthak methods were compared directly with human-guided approaches. The results were so obvious that even the most conservative war chiefs could not deny them. Cubs raised with security and cooperative training grew larger, stronger, and more intelligent than those subjected to traditional isolation and competitive stress. More importantly, they maintained their Vorthak identity while developing capabilities that surpassed anything seen in recent generations. War Chief Grandar, who had initially opposed human influence, became one of its strongest advocates after observing the changes in his own offspring. "We thought we were preserving strength," he admitted to the Vorthak High Council. "Instead, we were creating weakness. The humans have shown us how to recover what we lost when fear replaced wisdom in our child-rearing practices." The ripple effects continued to spread. Species that had been enemies for centuries began to cooperate when their youth, raised under human guidance, refused to continue ancestral conflicts. Young beings who had learned to see differences as advantages rather than threats became natural diplomats and peacemakers. A year after the Void Hunter battle, Elder Kethmore convened a special session of the Galactic Council to address the long-term implications of human influence on galactic civilization. The discussion was unprecedented in its scope and implications. "We are witnessing the emergence of a new type of galactic citizen," he announced. "Young beings who think beyond species boundaries, who solve problems through cooperation rather than domination, and who view diversity as strength rather than weakness. The question before us is whether we will support this evolution or attempt to suppress it." The debate was intense, with some council members arguing that traditional cultural values were being eroded beyond recognition. Others pointed out that the improvements in interspecies cooperation, technological advancement,